Psychic indeterminacy is marked by interruptions and moments that intervene, arrest, and intensify the impressions of what we see and feel. This is a form of mental movement evoked in the experience of something, namely the pictorial, but in this case the virtual. A feeling of anxiety arises in the uncertainty of indeterminacy, in the relationship between what we see and how we exist as observers, evoking questions, gaps, and feelings of self-doubt. What I'm describing emerges in the gap, conjuring a dualistic sense of terror and astonishment. The sublime, the aesthetic judgment that produces that very feeling of psychic indeterminacy, abstracts you from sequence and absorbs you into an interior landscape that fills the mind. Astonishment forms in the judgment of the sublime, whereby what we see ignites some otherworldly feeling that fails to leap from the tongue. This is an abstract and subjective feeling that forms out of the limits of experience. And so the purpose of this text, and its waxing video essay format, is to leave behind some essence of explanation, an atom of meaning expressed through the junction of aesthetics and gameplay. Across my episodes of exploration, the default to my initial feeling was terror in confronting the unknown in the outer wilds. While it was easy to relax into the lack of consequence privileged by the narrative time loop, there was an inability to compensate mentally, to brace myself for each perilous event and encounter with the unknown that would span across each reset. Dealing with matters of emotional or mental compensation during gameplay develops out of an experiential feeling that has long been something I have thought about. For some time, the Outer Wilds committed some sort of violence on my imagination, sowing doubt in my capability to negotiate perception, settling this inarticulable gap into cliché. Ultimately here, what I'm getting at relates to a distance between the observer and the observed that manifests a gap between description and perception. Observing and understanding is the entire impetus for the character you play, born out of a tradition to travel the solar system that by the end implicates your exploration not as a passive observer but as a collaborator. What we see and how we feel is evoked through the first-person perspective, establishing a thesis in the eye of the universe through metaphor and action. The eye emerges as a being that signals itself as an example of the sublime, affecting the imagination and representing a challenge that this video will try to undertake as a matter of articulating why the Outer Wilds generates such a sense of cognitive uncertainty. Taking the sublime into consideration, there are key examples exemplified in each point of interest that exists as part of the solar system and the Outer Wilds that composes what I'll be referring to as the narrative structure of experience. At a macro scale, the most overt feature surges from the environmental unknown that exists in the scene of the Herthian solar system, eliciting a vastness that tests the limits of experience through spatial, temporal, and conceptual perception, all of which affects the imagination in play. Experiencing the Outer Wilds requires engaging with the powers of the unknown that lay scattered among the celestial points of interest, eventually confronting you with an otherness in your journey to unravel the mystery of the time loop. But more than a sense of otherness that provokes my interest is the desire to close the gap that invades between reason and imagination, perception and description that is marked by an abyssal presence during each venture. There is this idea of a negative pleasure that stems from confronting the vacuum of space that so readily evokes a sense of helplessness in the observer. Here, feelings of agency slip away beneath an emerging aesthetic potential that provokes the limits of experience. Aesthetically, I'm referring to the sublime, but essentially, I'm talking about the exploration of the colossal, the vastness of space that contains all matters of the unknown. What endures in exploring the unknown in the Outer Wilds exists in its ability to evoke a feeling that is abruptly separate from an identifiable meaning. Meaning in this context may or may not reveal some metaphysical truth, but it is my contention that the sublime as a concept and aesthetic experience reveals some nature of meaning through the narrative's mystery in the Outer Wilds. At the center of the game's mystery, the eye of the universe expresses the sublime in its violent incommensurability, functioning as a paradoxical entity through its quantum presence. As a matter of aesthetics, there is a tension that emerges from the eye as a sublime entity that represents a sort of violence on the imagination because it possesses the properties of an object that defies measurement in the mind. Through exploration, the sublime exists in accord with overwhelming properties that accompany feelings of insignificance or vulnerability, out of which forms a sense of self-negation, a negative feeling, and the violence that strains cognition through perception. However, despite the gap between description and perception that evokes a distance between meaning and feeling, the structure of experiencing the sublime allows also for some level of attunement to occur through the failure to take in the inexplicable as you discover and experience the unknown. The mapping of perception through the first-person perspective lends itself well to witnessing and experiencing self-negation. For example, the black hole at the center of Brittle Hollow involves a sublime experience because we lack the knowledge of its heuristic, that is to say, what occurs when we enter it. Falling into the black hole, whether by mistake or on purpose, evokes a suddenness that is intrinsic to the sublime by overwhelming you through a spatial, temporal, and conceptual shift, placing you at the edge of the solar system on the other side of a white hole. Travel through the black hole arouses, in brief, a sense of violence and self-dislocation via the emerging scene of the derelict white hole station that awaits you on the other side. Blotting out the sun from your vision, this station emerges as an unknown object that accentuates the colossal by framing the star system in front of you. And more importantly, it constrains a sense of cognitive balance because of your initial lack in understanding. Mind you, I'm speaking as if you entered the black hole separate from your ship by accident. However, if you entered it while in the confines of your ship, there's no doubt the initial encounter would still evoke a muted version of what I'm describing. But even the black hole in its totality eventually becomes familiar after the shocking arrival, which is why I attribute a heuristic to it. The way the sublime is encountered through exploration in the outer wilds has a sense of boundlessness that stems from the interruption of action and agency, provoking an emotional involvement through an initial terror or prolonged sense of awe as pretense. And so there are layers to the representation of the sublime in the outer wilds that revolves around how the exploration of the colossally unfamiliar consequentially renders a sense of self-negation in the subject. As a game, this sense of self-negation might happen through visual and sonic aspects as part of the environmental composition that arouses the sublime true to certain properties. I think about this in terms of how the unknown evokes a sense of scale and proximity that affects feelings of control relative to the first-person perspective, such as the confrontation with the black hole, where the limits of knowledge foreground the imminence of the sublime. How close you are to falling into the abyss is a question that marks your experience with indescribable powers that overwhelm with affect, a sense of self-negation related to your physical insignificance and vulnerability. The idea of self-negation here is an emotional component of the sublime that underpins player exploration and the thematic core of Outer Wilds. The eye, or the interloper comet, detail a narrative of experience similar to that of the owl elk or the nomai in the diegesis. What I mean by this concerns an emotional reflex to seeing something that cannot be described. And that feeling, that gap that opens between description and cognition, creates this irreducible feeling of terror that shapes a feeling of self-negation and the recognition of something sublime because of its effective and aesthetic powers. For the owl elk to burn all records of the eye and cloak its signal exists as a result of self-negation that aims to accommodate for the shock in their imagination, a result of the eye showing them the destruction of the universe. The actions of the owl elk exemplify finality in the narrative structure of their experience, reflecting a cognitive accommodation. What I'm describing as accommodation pervades in the experience of the Outer Wilds in the abruptness of exploration. The eye, the interloper, dark bramble, and the stranger. All of these major points of interest in the Outer Wilds are aesthetically sublime in how they relate to the player via scale and impact. These are hyper-objects in addition because of their immediacy and the ability to shape the reality of the diegesis, in addition to how they are perceived and experienced through formal properties such as visuals, gameplay, or sound. As hyper-objects, it is their sense of nearness that matters, and how they fascinate, disturb, and evoke a sense of wonder. The mystery of the eye, or the cloaked stranger, or the tragedy of the interloper as a sun-grazer comet, or the peril of dark bramble that holds feldspar and the nomai vessel, all of these are hyper-objects that attune to the sublime in their sheer otherness. Numerous instances throughout the Outer Wilds envelop you in a scene that breaks in the narrative continuum to introduce intensities of the unknown. The eye is an example of this as a quantum object and an entity that marks the end. First captured the imagination of the owl elk, only to instill a sense of terror and alienation that colored their experience of reality. Terror turns to comfort in the familiarity that is accommodated by the eye as hyperobject in reflecting something beautiful rather than sublime once the hatchling reaches it. For the Nomai, a different reaction came from the eye as a hyperobject. As a separate example, the ring world of the stranger is aesthetically evocative in its alien appearance, while the interior structures, the water and the flora, accommodate the sublime through a picturesque interior. Both the eye and the stranger, while disparate as hyperobjects, generate a similar affectability for the Nomai and the owl, in addition to how their extra diegetic properties summon a sense of self-negation. The way the stranger first emerges as this vessel, shrouded in darkness, evokes the sublime and a feeling of self-negation that may give you pause until you reach the interior because of the cloaking device that swallows you in darkness. Distinct to the stranger, the interloper enters the solar system as a hyperobject, radiating immense energy. Like the stranger, it exists as a hyperobject in how it imposes a simultaneous nearness and distance. The stranger, looming above, blocks the signal of the eye, while the interloper travels along an elliptical orbit, grazing the sun, while the echoes of its emergence litter the solar system in the form of ghost matter. The explosion of ghost matter wiped all living things as a hard reset, working as a sublime trigger on an ecological level. An apocalyptic event that interrupts reality and awakens a cognitive indeterminacy through a feeling of terror. As the hatchling, the emptied-out interloper reveals the end for the Nomai and echoes the sublime in the abruptness of their end. The interloper maintains its status as a hyperobject by virtue of its strangeness, its nearness, and its total and complete indifference as an object marked for potential by the Nomai, capable of powering the star detonator which previously failed in activation, and yet now a roaming memorial for the Nomai civilization's end. The fifth planet in the solar system, dark bramble, encapsulates the very essence of the sublime and the very idea of the hyperobject in its cosmic insidiousness. Not only does it impinge on your awareness as an anomaly among planets, it lingers and represents the same potential as the interloper because it signals the end, via the seeds you find on other planets, marking the beginning of their infection. Inward, dark bramble defies spatial logic through its nodal connections, the convoluted ways in which the bramble twists and turns, and contains vast interiors. Dark bramble avails itself as a strange object that escapes the powers of cognition when you enter, and evokes the sublime in perception and imagination in what it suggests. The particularity of hyperobjects relates not so much to the object itself here, rather it is the withdrawn reality that exists behind the object, behind something like the interloper, or dark bramble, or even the eye itself, constituting its relations. Dark bramble as a hyperobject is so on the basis of its existence and spread, while it works as sublime configuration, emerging through aesthetics and its properties, and in the experience of what exists within, how the interior of the bramble twists space and introduces itself as this abyssal dimension. What once was the fifth planet in the solar system now exists as a fragmented network of plant growth and dimensional inconsistency. How does this entity exist, and why does it exist? What underlies its proliferation? These are questions that inform upon the concept of the hyperobject because of the non-locality and temporal movement that it possesses, where the former is defined by how dark bramble is comprised by its particularity, by its nodal maze, and its composition, while the latter refers to its futural emission and effects on causality through its spread to other planets. Wandering from planet to planet, the quantum moon exemplifies the cognitive evasiveness of the hyperobject by existing as local and non-local entity. And yet for the Nomai, the quantum moon became a junction of familiarity, with the moon itself becoming less a strange stranger and more of an object in the mesh of the solar system's ecology. How the Nomai interacted with the quantum moon, venturing to its surface as traditional practice, amounts to a level of attunement with the moon and the eye in relation. The role of the sublime here involves a confrontation with an aesthetic feeling, so to speak, and its being as hyperobject speaks with a forked tongue when you encounter Solanum at the sixth location. Far from the reach of the interloper that exploded, destroying the entirety of the Nomai civilization, she remains alive as the last living Nomai, and yet it's because of the quantum moon superpositionality that Solanum is very much so dead in 5 of the 6 realities in which she was present. This sort of entanglement with the moon and with the player works as a limit experience through this sort of evasiveness of hyperobjects that produces feelings of desubjectification. Selenium's status and the status of the moon opens as a journey and ends as a warped causality that reflects a terror and empathy for Selenium's experience. Finding refuge in the experience of hyperobjects and the sublime is an aesthetic experience. The Nomai and the owl elk differ in their responses to the eye signal. Comparing the Nomai to the owl elk hedges some of my own individual speculation in analyzing the experiential response and the forms of accommodation that the Nomai would attune to, if only because it establishes a dualism based off of responses of fear and acceptance. What I mean by this relates to the narrative of experience that results in differing outcomes based upon the nature of the owl elk versus the Nomai. I lead with the example of the owl elk, who come from a different solar system, tracing the signal of the eye that they received as they looked to the stars. The arrival of the owl elk at the eye sets into motion the narrative structure of their experience, challenging the limits of their cognitive capacities through the eye's revelation. The artifacts the owl elk left behind paint a picture of how the eye filled them with astonishment. Drawn to the eye, its signal catalyzed the owl elk to build the ring world of the stranger out of the natural resources of their homeworld, destroying its beauty to chase the sublime, collapsing any certainty of place for the owl elk with no home to return to and only the stranger to reside upon. The final moment that shapes the experience of the sublime is evinced in the refuge that one takes to accommodate for the powers of one's aesthetic experience. The owl elk in this case shows estrangement out of fear, shuttering the signal of the eye and resigning themselves to a virtual space, safe from the nightmare of the impending destruction that the owl elk saw within the eye. Where the Nomai differ relates to their cultural philosophy. Driven by the impetus of knowledge, the Nomai heard the call of the eye like the owl elk, without hesitation warped to the signal due to their curiosity. This decision, while fatal for some, spurred forth a new Nomai civilization that was dedicated to discovering the secrets of the eye. The only direct access that the Nomai would have to the eye came from their travels to the quantum moon, due to the eye's location being blocked by the stranger. The Nomai shuddered to ignore an entity that was older than the universe itself, and endeavored to advance technology to a point in which the eye could be discovered. Speculating on how the Nomai would attune differently to the eye is based on the strategies they took in trying to discover its location, creating a time loop of 22 minutes, which was just long enough for their probe to locate the eye. Developing the technology able to capture probe results through one's memories is how the Hearthian became trapped in the time loop as the eventual successor to the Nomai's plan, contingent upon the sun supernova as activation. As an alternate example that fits into the narrative structure of experiencing hyperobjects and the aesthetic sublime, the pursuit of the Nomai before their end suggests an attunement to the eye that would diverge from estrangement and toward a sense of fullness through the eye's projection of the conscious observer. Thus, the ways in which self-negation is dealt with, distinct to the owl elk and the Nomai, are disparately reflected in the ways they accommodate the sublime as an aesthetic experience, ultimately shaping their ambitions. The hatchling standing at the edge of the universe, and at the edge of time, successfully links the structure of experience to the Nomai by fulfilling their goals of discovery. The growing darkness from the view of the Nomai vessel's control deck, as stars blink from existence in front of you, is precisely what this video essay is about. It is an overwhelming sense of indifference to your being, a swelling self-negation full of negative and positive emotions that manifests in our own contingency. It leaves you with a feeling of antinomy, incompatible sensations, and the confrontation of experience, scooping you out from the inside. Watching things fade after your arrival at the eye has the ability to evoke accommodations similar to that of the owl elk or the Nomai. You are at the end, so how do you embrace it? The eye reflects the mind of the hatchling and materializes those you met across your journey. The eye catalyzes a feeling of self-negation that produces an accommodation of fullness in the connective mesh that is reflected among the friends that gathered around the fire. Nowhere more does this theme of self-negation in the experience of the sublime reflect better than the final instance around the campfire overall. The culmination of your journey ending in the eruption of the colossal, where your role is to now witness a new genesis that beholds a sense of fullness and the necessity of connection, the explosion of a new universe, a new hyperobject. In this, the eye literalizes the concept of ekphrasis, suspending the player in time before the very end, existing as an entity that looms on the peripheries of descriptive prose as quantum mirror. It is not the experience of the sublime that generates a metaphysical insight into the role of the hatchling as they fulfill the eye's cry for a witness. Rather, it is what's produced in the tension of experience, made in the feeling of self-negation, that calls attention to the structure of experience and how one finds refuge as a cognitive agent to the end of the universe and to the traveler's encore. The experience of the outer wilds cannot be measured in a single narrative of perception, but in the multiple overlapping instances that bridge the gap between imagination and reason through specific moments of refuge. The Outer Wilds thematically succeeds at inducing feelings of self-negation in its constellation of hyper-objects and experiences with the aesthetic sublime and the paradoxical accommodation that accepts annihilation, where the eye becomes what it beholds in the interlude of something new that implicates the observer as a collaborator in kind.